honor and praise and glory. God's deserving of that. Brethren, what's our attitude when we come to worship? What's our attitude when we are coming to hear from God, when we're coming to commune with Him? What's the disposition, the attitude of our hearts as we come together? How do we position ourselves? How do we look upon ourselves? 7 times in this passage, he speaks of the voice of the Lord. And if you read in the language that's used here, it's used in the language of a great storm that is howling. It's the idea of there is the thundering voice of God that's being heard, that there is the lightning that is crashing around about us, and that all these things are recognizing and knowing His majesty, His power, His glory. Do we? Do we, when we gather ourselves together in worship to God, what's our attitude and disposition of heart? Where do we place ourselves, and what kind of reverence and fear do we gather together with? Let me ask you a question, because this is in the context of what he's dealing with here and what he's describing here. If there is a terrible, horrible storm that is coming, or that you're in the midst of, what are you doing? If you hear sirens going off, and in the midst of those sirens you're having thunderings and lightnings, the rain is crashing down, the wind is howling, and with all of that you're hearing, what are you doing? Are you sitting whistling? Just like nothing's going on? What do you do? How do you react in the midst of a storm? And I'll tell you that most people in this area of the country, because of what we've gone through before, because we've seen the devastation of tornadoes and storms, many of us will run to our storm shelters. We'll run to a place where we have safety. And even there, we sit quietly. It's not commonly a time when we gather ourselves together and engage in partying. It's a time of great thought and seriousness because of what's going on. Now, if you don't have such a place, such a storm shelter, then you find yourself huddled in some small area of the house where you think you're most protected. More commonly than not, it's not a time when we're hooting and hollering and carrying on. It's a time of great soberness. It's a time of great reflection. It's a time where there is a seriousness about our situation and what we're dealing with. It's also a time when we're crying out to God, commonly. People who may not cry out to God and may not care about God and may not have an interest in God at any other time, in the midst of such storms, they're crying out, God help us. God be with us. God protect us. Brethren, when you're in those positions, when you're in that circumstance, there's fear. Fear of what's going to happen to me. Fear of what kind of devastation is coming. Fear of whether or not I'm going to be able to live through this. There is a fear as we face the power of God. Now here we are in Psalm 29. And he says that we ought to be worshiping the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Brethren, how do we, what is our attitude and disposition of heart as we gather ourselves together and as we pray, as we sing, as we study, as we gather around the table, as we give as we've been prospered upon the first day of the week? What's the disposition and attitude of our hearts as we do that? And what kind of fear and reverence do we face those occasions with? He speaks of these as being the voice of the Lord on the waters. It's the idea of God crying out from the midst of the storm. You hear Him and you fear Him. And that's what He's describing in Psalm 29. It's a disposition and attitude that we ought to have as we come before God. Not a fearful for death or a fear of dying, but a fear of God and of His majesty, His supremacy, of who He is and who we are before Him. You see, this idea of worshiping the Lord in the beauty of holiness, that's the idea of us realizing who we are before Him. And brethren, it's a beautiful thing to think that the God of heaven, who created all things, who brought all things into being by simply the word of His mouth, that same God is in power. He sits upon His throne. He rules. He reigns. As we gather ourselves together, we ought to realize how small, how insignificant in many ways we are in His sight. I know we're precious as Christians. I know God sees us as being His precious possession. But I would also tell you that there is this idea of having a holiness about us, a separateness about us, a sanctity about us as we gather ourselves before Him. He speaks of the voice of the Lord. When God is speaking, do you listen? I tell you, in the midst of a storm, you're listening. You've got your ears attuned to what's going on outside. You're listening to see what the storm is doing. You're looking to see what direction it's coming from, what direction it's moving. You're looking to see how much wind. You're looking to see all of these things about it, and you have a desire and an interest, an intent interest in what's going on as the storm is howling. Do we come before God with that same kind of reverence and fear? With that same kind of desire to listen, to hear Him, to understand Him, to know what His will is, to be admonished by Him, to be encouraged by Him, whatever it is that we need, that we would receive it from Him and crying out for it from Him? Because we're serving Him. In this passage, he speaks of the cedars of Lebanon. He talks about God breaking them. Brethren, he's talking about His power, His majesty. How often do we stop and think about how powerful and how majestic our God is and what all He can do and does? How often do we think of His power as we stand before Him, as we live before Him, and specifically in this context as we gather before Him to worship? What's the attitude and disposition we have? Because this all-powerful God, who can take the cedars of Lebanon, this majestic, strong, abiding, lasting tree, and can just snap it off. Do we come before Him with reverence and godly fear? Do we gather ourselves together before Him in that? When he speaks here and he talks about the voice of the Lord divideth the flames of fire, that's the lightning. Brethren, when there's the lightning, and the lightning strikes, and it strikes somewhere close, you're shaken. Because of how near it is, how close it is. Brethren, how close is God to you, or are you to God right now? Where do we sit right now as we're gathered before Him? Do we hear His voice? Do we want to know what His will is? And when He speaks, do we listen carefully, intently, determined to know what His will is and to live His will in our lives day by day? Is that who we are? It speaks of how He shakes the wilderness in verse 8. When the earth is shaking around us, He says that's the kind of fear, that's the kind of reverence we ought to have as we come before God. Brethren, I don't mean here fear in the sense of being afraid, being timid, but it's the kind of disposition we ought to have because of who our God is and the power that our God holds and who we are before Him and the place He deserves in our lives. And for that reason, His voice that cries out over and over and over again, 7 times in this passage, the voice of the Lord, 7 times crying out. 7 is a number that means something. You may remember that from our studies previously on different things. Number 7 is a number of completeness. The idea of 7 times saying the voice of the Lord is the idea of listening to everything He says, hearing all that He cries. And listen attentively to what He says, what His will is. He speaks of the power of His voice. Rather than too often today, people have no fear of God, and they have no fear of His voice. They don't listen to Him. They don't hear His word. They have no care or concern about what God says or what His will is in their lives. They scoff at it. They laugh at it. It's as if they're standing in the midst of a storm and they're laughing. They're making fun of the idea that there's such a raging storm. Brethren, it's a fool that does that. Just as tonight, it's a foolish individual who comes before God without reverence and godly fear. Who doesn't know who God is and who doesn't stand before Him in reverence to Him and to His Word, realizing who we are and what we're here for. He says in verses 10 and 11, then after He has spoken of the voice of the Lord, He says this, the Lord sitteth upon the flood. That word flood there is a word that is used only on few occasions in the Old Testament. It's a unique Hebrew word, and every time it's used, it's referring to the flood during the days of Noah, unless this is an exception. But since that's what He's referring to every other time He uses the word, it makes me think that that's what He's referring to now. And as you think about that flood and God sitting upon it, that is, it was being brought by God. What does that do to us as we stand before Him? The Lord sitteth upon the flood, yea, the Lord sitteth King forever. Many try to dethrone Him. Many try to cast Him down. Many try to put themselves in His place, but it never happens. He still rules. He's still the King of kings, Lord of lords. He's still in power. He's still on His throne. He has not moved. And that being true, we ought to be begging for strength. As it says in verse 11, the Lord will give strength unto His people. The Lord will bless His people with peace. If you want the strength that you need in times of storm, and if you want the peace in the middle of a storm, remember who you serve. Remember who God is. Remember His majesty, His might, and glorify Him in your worship. as you come before it. As you gather together to offer up your praise to Him. Do it recognizing who He is and showing Him the honor that He deserves. Brethren, too often today, people in this world have no thoughts of God. No concern for Him or His will. No willingness to submit to Him, listen to Him, hear Him, do what He says. And yet, the psalmist here in Psalm 29 is saying we better listen. We better hear His voice. We better submit to His voice. We better give attention to what He says. We better do that because the storms come. Not a tornado, not a hurricane, but the storms that beset us in life. And as those storms come upon us, if we don't have God to see us through, we won't make it. If we don't prepare ourselves for the last storm in the last day, we won't survive it. Not in a good way. The 29th Psalm is a psalm of David as he's telling us to worship God, to serve Him, to give Him His place in our lives. Does He have His place in your life? Are you a Christian? Are you? If you've never obeyed the gospel, why? What do you wait for? Why do you put it off? What's the reason why you keep pushing it away? Because in the storms of life, you need someone who will help you through them. And there's only one who can help you survive them. If you're one of His children, you wandered away, why wouldn't you come home? Why wouldn't you be restored to your first love? Why wouldn't you come back to the one who can give you power and strength to carry on in the midst of the storms? That one who can help you to rest daily in peace, knowing that whatever happens, God is here. He's with you. And He'll see you through. If tonight you're not a Christian, we beg you to become one. If you are one of God's children, you wandered away, we would beg you to come home. While you have time and opportunity, we beg you to do that now as we stand and sing.